right. Thank you everyone for joining us today. This is a recording for Black Minds Collaborative, and I am joined by other experts in the field, and we are here today to demystify the process and give you some tips on how to seek mental health care. So I will let the panelists introduce themselves. Crystal.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Crystal McLeod, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker as well as a mental health therapist. So thank you for having me today.
Thanks. Brandon?
Hey, good morning. So I am Brandon Johnson. I am a subject matter expert in suicide prevention and work closely on Black mental health and suicide, as well as faith communities and suicide prevention.
Thanks. Juliette?
Hi, I'm Juliette McClendon. I am a psychologist. I'm an assistant professor at Boston University School of Medicine, and I focus mainly on the impact of racial stress and trauma on mental health.
Great, thank you. And I'm Janel. I founded Black Minds Collaborative, and I also work as a therapist and a suicidologist. So the first question that I have for you all are, what are some signs that would let someone know that they should consider seeking professional mental health help?
So I think one of the things to consider and to think about is when dealing with life and life stressors, when you have those natural things that, cause stress and cause, some anxiety, and you're experiencing some of these things and you have your regular coping mechanisms. So it may be reading a book, it may be taking a nap, it may be relaxing, watching a good television program. If you're finding yourself still struggling and those coping mechanisms are not working the way that they used to, and you're starting to feel burnt out, that you can't really find a solution to what you're going through, and it's been consistent and persistent, that's usually a good sign to let you know that it may be time to seek some mental health therapy, to get into the therapy space to really help you to find new ways to cope, new ways to manage, and new strategies for improving your mental health.
Yeah, something I hear a lot from people who notice that they may need some extra help is a lot of times trouble with sleep often comes up first. So if you're having trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, or if you're sleeping more than usual, I think, if you're feeling more exhausted than usual, and like Brandon said, if you're engaging in those coping mechanisms and things like watching TV, reading, going for a walk, and you're finding you're not really enjoying them as much as usual, I think that can be another really big sign that things are starting to get more difficult.
Mm-hmm. It's a good point about the sleep. I think that's something that a lot of my clients also report having difficulty with, and a lot of times they initially seek somatic medical care because they think that it's a physical health problem as opposed to a mental health problem. So it's definitely important to highlight the connection there between mental well-being and sleep. Crystal, did you have anything to add?
One of the things that I see quite a bit in my practice is a lot of irritability, and obviously by the nature of what I do, we naturally function as, at a higher level of stress and pressure than most folks in certain settings. But I see a lot of irritability, a lot of outbursts, a lot of snappiness. That's usually one of the bigger things that I see people coming into my office. And then of course, once you kind of start assessing that part, we may find other issues as well. But that's one of the big things, just cannot manage the stress. And just noticing that they're being a little more snappy with their kids, or they're being a little more irritable with their spouse, or, that sleep thing, just like you said, is really big as well, especially in my space as well. So that's one of the big things I notice is the irritability. When you're noticing that you cannot even control that, your own mood, when your mood is shifting, you're being irritable with people that you love and you care about, and it's not normal, and you can't control it, like Brandon said, it's probably time to seek some additional support as well.
I think that's such a good point.
Yeah, and on that, with the irritability, you might see that your relationships are starting to suffer. So maybe you're starting to have more conflict with people. or maybe you're isolating and withdrawing from people. You don't really want to engage in the ways that you typically do. That can be a good indication that it's time to seek some professional support.
One other thing I'll add is I think sometimes what really can clue people in is that some of the more basic self-care things start going out the window. So like, eating regularly, showering regularly, exercise, all those things kind of start to fade away, or like we don't have as much energy to engage in those things. So that can often be a sign as well.
Excellent point. Excellent point. So what are some barriers that Black people and other people of color face to seeking mental health care? I know that's something we could have a whole course on, right?
I'll just say, I was just listening to a podcast yesterday with Imani. She's a psychiatrist, and she was talking about, John Hopkins, a study through John Hopkins, where mental health professionals, psychiatry, psychology, social work, are less than 5% of us are Black, right? And so even in the social work field, less than 10% of us are licensed and clinically licensed as Black social workers. So that in itself, in my opinion, is a barrier. I do feel like it's, why it's not inclusive to everyone, to be able to go to someone for help that looks like you, someone that you feel can relate to what you're going through, even if it's not, I can relate to every problem that you have. The fact that, hey, I get it, may be something that is really helpful. And I find that even in my own practice, I am the only Black therapist in my clinic. So yes, I see primarily, especially during this time, a lot of the minority younger folks do request to see me because, they feel like I can get it. Or even my colleagues will sometimes come to me and say, hey, I think you are a better fit for this client based on the need, because I can't relate and I can't help them the way that you probably can. So I think that one of the biggest barriers, just professionally, it's not enough of us in the clinical field, in the clinical space to allow Black people to come in and get the help and feel comfortable about doing it.
Mm-hmm.
That's such an important point. Like, even in my space, like I work with a lot of families, like outside of, my 9 to 5, like working with a lot of families, trying to get them connected to care. And I ask them their preferences, and they want someone who looks like them. And so, I have, people I go to and people that I know how to get to, and they are booked solid, which is great. Like, it's fantastic that people are going to seek them out. But because of that data statistic that you just dropped, Crystal, that's the problem, is that once they're booked, they're like, I don't know, where else to go. And then they start to kind of drift away from wanting care when they can't get care from the people that they want to get it from. And so I think that's a really huge barrier for people. And even finding, a therapist, if they're not Black, like to find someone who can display cultural humility, where's the metric for that? Like, how do you, when you go to look for a therapist, it's hard to, for a person to point out, like, oh, I think this person will get it or this person won't. It's such a great thing in therapy. And even when I was looking for my therapist, I didn't, stop until I found a Black therapist. And I found my therapist is a Black woman. And we've had conversations where we'd be like, yeah, and then at work, then this happened. And I'm like, right. And I didn't even have to explain the whole situation. Like, I stopped at a certain point and she knew exactly what the rest of the story was. And that builds that, therapeutic rapport. And without it, it's difficult for people, for Black people in particular, to kind of engage in the therapeutic process.
I think another barrier that comes up is that within Black communities as well as other communities, there can be a stigma around seeking help for mental for mental health struggles. And I think that it's very understandable why that carries a stigma with it. I think that there is a way in which sometimes mental health struggles can be viewed as something that should be dealt with sort of maybe within the family, or that like, I'm strong enough to deal with this, you know, especially as Black people. We've been through so much as within our communities, within our families, and as individuals, that we've been so resilient to. And so to feel like we may need to seek professional help can sometimes feel like we've failed, or that we're giving up on taking care of our problems. And so sometimes that gets in the way. And I think the other thing is that there's been some research on this, that, you know, as a Black person, oftentimes our identity as a Black person is already so stigmatized in our society. And then to take on this additional stigma of a mental health problem can oftentimes just seem very daunting and very scary, and can feel like it's going to have a negative impact on us. Sort of, it might do more harm than good. And so I think that that is a big barrier that gets in the way. And I think there are a lot of really valid things about that fear. But I think we're also here today to sort of try and dispel some of those fears. And even if there are maybe some myths around mental health problems and seeking professional help.
I also think even if we go back, because when we talk about the kind of, when we're talking now, we're talking about people that actually have the knowledge and the access, right? And people that actually know how to get mental health care, but there may be a barrier. But also when we look at more marginalized communities, they have no idea where to start. Right? They have no idea where to start. You know, if I go to this medical appointment, you know, I may get fired from my job because I need to be working, right? They may not have insurance to be able to pay for mental health care. You know, community mental health can be a very overwhelming system as well. And a lot of times, you know, it can be that mental health support, not saying it is, but I'm saying it can be that support to where we got to put a Band-Aid on this for right now, right? Because we have so much other things to do and so many other people to take care of. And so I do think, you know, being a young, I grew up in the South, and I'm gonna be real, you know, everything that was wrong, I had to go to the Lord, you know, I had to pray. We got to talk to the pastor, you know what I mean? So that wasn't really something that in my family, mental health was not, you know, going to therapists or doing those types of things. That was not something that was present in my family. It was, we're going to pray about it. It's going to be okay. And I think sometimes while faith is a great thing to have, sometimes that can be a barrier to us as well in our communities.
I wanted to jump in on that faith piece real quick. Like it's so, you know, it's so critical and so, you know, and so honest. And so there's, you know, work to try to pull the faith community in to be able to have these conversations with people in the faith community, you know, just because there's so much of it that is considered a lack of faith. You know, like, you know, suicide or having suicidal ideation is like a huge thing. Like nobody wants to bring that up in faith communities because people have, you know, deemed it like the unforgivable sin. And then on top of that, like just, you know, having depression is a sign of like not being thankful or not being appreciative or not being grateful. And so, you know, even the act of going to seek therapy, you know, oftentimes may feel sacrilegious because of, you know, what's been put in us over generations with the faith piece. So yeah, that's a really critical point too.
I think there's also a lot of founded mistrust in the medical community because of the very long history of exploitation, experimentation without consent. And so there's this distrust and fear that somehow seeking care might worsen the situation, or you might not get what you need. And I think that's a valid fear, but I hope that we can kind of talk through some solutions to that fear as well to make sure people aren't struggling or think that their current state is somewhere that they have to stay. So.
And the minimization of what goes on. A lot of times when we come into offices, doctors' offices, clinics, you know, we express, we feel a certain way. Sometimes it's minimized, right? Like we're not being, heard, and I'll tell you, my cousin recently was having some medical issues, and she's a licensed clinical social worker that works in the medical field. Went to the ER. She could not get people to listen to her symptoms. They just wanted to medicate. And she's just like, no, you have to listen to me. These things are actually happening. And so I think sometimes we don't feel heard in the medical setting, and our feelings are minimized when we come in. Oh, well, you'll be fine. It's really not bad. Let's give you some ibuprofen. Let's give you these things. So it's a turnoff automatically when you don't feel like someone is actually listening to you when you come into their office. So imagine coming in a mental health clinic trying to tell someone what you're experiencing, and by automatic stigma and what people perceive us to be as Black people, it's minimizing the fact that yes, I may be depressed, or I may have anxiety, or those different types of things. So I think sometimes, it's tougher for clinicians to especially that don't understand our dynamic and understand the things that we go through and experience, to really listen to what we're doing and diagnose appropriately and things like that, which is why I feel like it's so important for us to be in those clinical spaces, because we can take the social and behavior and the environment of our own people and understand it a lot of times better than others, and can kind of take that into our mental health assessment and make a judgment based off that. So that's just another area that I see as well.
Any other barriers that you all can think of or that we haven't touched on yet? So I took a list of the barriers that we did talk about. So now I want to move into talking about some ways to overcome them. So in finding a therapist who looks like you, or finding a non-Black therapist who displays cultural humility, those were two barriers that we discussed. I think we can talk about them in the portion where we talk about finding a therapist and finding a therapist who's a good fit. So stigma around seeking help for mental health. What are some ways that people can overcome that stigma if they feel it is impeding them from getting the help that they need?
I think right now, one of the great things that is happening, I think, even with this space of like COVID-19 and the stress that people have seen there, and the things that have happened with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others, has really opened the door for people who look like us to really share their stories of how therapy has worked for them. I've seen so many pushes of organizations and people just sharing, like, this is something that I went through, and this is helpful, just because there are so many people right now who've been impacted by, race-based trauma, and looking at what's been happening on the news and actually thinking about how they've been impacted about it, by it in their own lives. That self-reflection, and then all of the myriad of things that have come as a part of COVID-19, there's been this renewed conversation around, Black people, where it's been something that you did, but you didn't necessarily like publicize it, or you didn't share it a lot. You didn't want people in your business or, family to kind of share what's going on. But there's been this renewed space of people sharing stories, sharing how they've, been in recovery, and just how the process is, and, how it's kind of a lifelong process. Like, and people have been going into this, really being open. I've seen people just do lives, like talking about this is what their experience was. And it's been encouraging other people to seek therapy out. It's kind of been breaking these barriers down, where it would be, decades ago, years ago, it would be a major secret that someone would keep to themselves, especially a Black person, and kind of wouldn't share it. As somebody said earlier, it's not to be labeled on top of the other labels that society puts on top of us. But to be able to have those conversations now and be open about the Black experience in totality. Like, there's so many different unique sections of it. And so the mental health piece is its own piece, and it's very much connected to everything else. But watching people like share and be open, like there are even organizations that have just had people on to talk about their experiences with therapy if they're comfortable. And it's really opened the door for people to say, this is something that we do. This is something that we can do, and something that a field that historically, as Janel said, hasn't been there for us is coming into a new age. And it is a safer place for us to be.
I think another thing is I think absolutely, Brandon. And seeking out those kinds of talks or stories that people share about their experiences. If you're thinking about, maybe I could use some therapy, but I'm not sure what to expect, or I don't know if it's going to help, seeking out some of those stories to get some inspiration and see that it has been helpful for other people is really important. I think another thing is that I think recognizing that we all can use a little extra support, especially right now. And it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with us or that we're not doing enough. There comes a point when the stress that we're under just naturally exceeds our ability to cope with it, just because it's so much, it's so overwhelming. So being isolated right now, people may have lost loved ones to COVID-19 or continuing to have to go to work in somewhat more dangerous situations. All of the, everything coming up about racism right now. I mean, this is just unprecedented. I mean, there's so much stress. And so to maybe have to go and seek out some professional help from someone who can help us sort of get our coping skills back on board, or just have somebody to listen to us without sort of trying to give us advice or anything like that right off the bat, can be so helpful. And it doesn't mean that we're doing anything wrong. It just means that we need to add an additional coping skill to our toolbox. And so I think trying to keep that in mind, that it doesn't mean there's something wrong with me. It means that I just need a little extra help right now, just like all of us, and I go to therapy too, and it's really helpful for me.
Yeah, I would definitely say that as well. One other thing too is I feel like clients should also interview their therapist. Okay. And let me tell you, I interviewed my therapist. And she's white, because we don't have that in this area here, right? And she's white, and I interviewed her up front in the beginning, right? Like, look, here's some of the things I'm struggling with. Do you think you can rate? Are you comfortable talking about these things, et cetera, et cetera? So I think that's important. It's okay. Just because we are considered the experts doesn't mean that it's a perfect fit, right? And I say that after every mental health initial assessment. After a few sessions, I try to evaluate, okay, how is this working for us? Are you getting anything? Do you feel like we vibe? I give my clients an option after the initial assessment. Are you more comfortable with a civilian person? Are you more comfortable with an active duty person? Are you more comfortable with a male or a female? I think we have to encourage our clients to advocate for themselves when something is not going okay. And that can kind of break down some barriers as well, because, if you feel comfortable that you can say to your therapist, hey, this ain't really working, maybe I should try someone else. So I think that's one of the biggest things. Don't quit. Just, hey, this is not working. If it's not working, maybe ask your therapist to refer you to someone else instead of just backing out of it. Because I think you have to find the fit to get the work done. Whether that person is Black, white, it doesn't matter. It has to really be a good fit. So don't be afraid to advocate for yourself. When you are looking for a therapist, tell a therapist what you're looking for, what you need, and ask, hey, can you handle this? Can you deal with this? Can you help and support me in this area?
Yeah, I think that's really important, because even if we are the most skilled therapist in the world, I firmly believe that at the end of the day, the relationship is the most important aspect of therapy, because if we don't have a good relationship, it doesn't matter what I try to do to help you with whatever it is you're dealing with. It's just not going to be as effective as it would be if we have a solid therapeutic relationship. So that communication is important. I love the notion of interviewing your therapist, especially we talked about how difficult it can be to find a therapist who looks like you, which is something that I went through when I was looking for a therapist who utilizes a specific treatment modality for something that I was dealing with. That narrowed my pool just to find someone who does that specific treatment, who accepts my insurance, and then to try to find someone who's Black it felt like I was looking for a unicorn. So that interview was really important about what I could talk to my therapist about, what my therapist felt comfortable discussing, but also that cultural humility piece was big for me, because my therapist is white, but because I knew this stuff going in, it just helped our therapeutic relationship and making sure that it was a good fit.
I think one other thing to keep in mind is you know, any therapy relationship doesn't have to last forever. I recently saw someone for like 6 weeks and he was able to kind of get back on track and feel good about how he was doing. So, you know, it doesn't have to last forever. It can sort of be however long you need it. The other thing is that, you know, I totally agree with interviewing your therapist. I think that's so important. And so I hope that we'll talk a little bit later more about like some questions you can ask and what that might look like. But yeah, it doesn't, and also anything you talk, and your therapist will talk to you about sort of limits of confidentiality, but you know, what you talk with your therapist about stays private and between you. So I think that sometimes people may have a fear that, you know, if I say something about something that it's going to get out, or that other people are going to find out that this happened to me, or whatever might be happening. And it's important to know that, you know, things stay confidential. And so you can share things that are going on with you and they won't get, you know, out to other people. And so it's a private, and it can be, and it's a safe space as well.
And I think reminding people of that can really help with the stigma piece of, if they want to keep this private, if they don't want people to know that they're seeking therapy, then, you know, that's something they don't have to worry about in terms of seeking services. Your therapist isn't going to go around letting anyone know that you're coming, let alone what you're discussing in sessions. Anything else on dealing with stigma or overcoming stigma when seeking help?
I would say one other thing, which is that now, especially now, there are a lot of online therapy resources. And so, you know, even, we'll talk about this more later, but even if you can't find a therapist in your area that you could see in person, there's a lot of ways to access therapy online. And I think that also can reduce some of the sort of stigma or some of what may get in the way of seeking therapy, especially if people live in like a small town or something and it's like everyone knows each other and I'm seeing like the one of 3 therapists in my town and I'm going to run into them. There are a lot of other options. And so keeping that in mind, and we'll talk about that more later, but there are a lot of different alternatives and different ways to find the kind of help that you need.
Good point. So we talked about folks maybe not knowing where to begin in terms of seeking mental health support. So maybe having insurance is a barrier, or finding an appointment time that works with their schedule. What are some of the basic things people need to know to get their journey started?
I will let Dr. M and Brandon discuss that one, because my territory is a little different. The access is abundant, right? And so I'll let you guys talk about that one, because I think you can probably answer that a lot different than I can.
I think there are a couple of things, and Juliette mentioned, like, you know, looking online for therapists. There are a ton now Black specific directories and databases that people have been creating to get people engaged in finding a therapist. One resource that I found that's really easy to use, like I know Black Mental Health Alliance has the ability to find a Black therapist in a specific area, and they're doing that across the country. And the Boris L. Henson Foundation is doing some of that work as well. And so like there are some online databases, even just Psychology Today, like being able to, you know, put in African-American therapist zip code, like in the Google, like it'll pull up some results and you're able to look for people that way. Another thing is that a lot of insurances do have behavioral health lines that you can call, and they can help, you know, refer you to some therapists in your area for you to be able to link with a therapist that way. Another resource that I'll mention too, for people, you know, worried about insurance and worried about payments, federally qualified health centers, a lot of them have mental health resources and therapists, and they use a sliding scale for their pay. And so even if you don't have insurance, like there's the ability to get care at a federally qualified health center. And many of them are like stationed in the community, like do a lot of good community work, have a pulse in the community. And a lot of the therapists, the doctors, the physicians everybody kind of in the mix are local. So there are people who understand even some local barriers as well. So those would be a couple places to kind of start and kind of get a sense of what's out there for you.
Speaking of sliding scales, I think another potential resource for people could be if you have a university in your area that has a clinical psychology or counseling psychology program, they often have clinics that are associated with the program where it's student therapy, but oftentimes they are also on a sliding scale. I agree, there are a lot of resources specific for Black people that you can access. Brandon mentioned a bunch of them. A couple more to mention. The Steve Fund has a crisis text line for students of color. So you can text Steve, S-T-E-V-E, to 741-741. And they also have a website. That's one way you could sort of, especially if you're in a crisis point and you just need help right away, that can be an option. If you go to the Association of Black Psychologists website, they have a function where you can search for therapists. They don't have chapters in every single city, but in a lot they do, and you can specifically identify Black psychologists in the area. And another thing is that if you call a psychologist and they say they're booked or they can't see you, you can ask them to give you some recommendations of other people in the area that you could contact. Therapy for Black Girls is awesome as well. Therapyforblackgirls.com, and they have a lot of resources there as well as just an online community. Another specific resource is Ayana Therapy. It's A-Y-A-N-A, and it's an online therapy resource that was created specifically for people of color and other people from other marginalized groups, so LGBTQ people as well. I also wrote a thread on this on Twitter. If you look up my Twitter handle, which is at Dr. Juliette M, and Black Mental Health, I ask people to put Black mental health resources on this thread. And so there's a lot of stuff on that as well that you can look at. So there are actually, more and more resources out there for people to look through. Another really basic resource is psychologytoday.com. And you can type in sort of a lot of different things that you're looking for. And you can find a therapist who sort of matches some of those things, as well as whether they take your insurance. You can go through your insurance's website, and you can find professionals that way as well. And then I know that there's this new one, but I think it may be just in the Northeast, but now I can't remember what it's called. It's called something like Zen Care. I'll have to look it up. But they do a really good job of, you can filter down to, I want a therapist of color who focuses on depression and does this kind of treatment. Like, you can get really down into the nitty gritty of what you're looking for as well.
Yeah, Psychology Today has those features too. In addition to searching by location, you can search to see what communities that therapist is allied with. You can see if they're doing telehealth or in-person sessions right now. You can see what insurance they accept, what conditions they treat, the type of treatment that they provide. And I really like Psychology Today because therapists have profiles, so it kind of gives you a little bit of insight into maybe what their style is, if you feel like that person would be a good fit. But like Juliette said, if that person is booked, you can always ask for recommendations from that person for referrals to other providers in the community.
And I found my therapist on Psychology Today, and it ended up working out. And people can always reach out to me. I can't speak for everyone, but like on Twitter, on social media, and I've sent people resource lists before that have been helpful for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, me too. I'm happy to do that as well. And I also found my therapist on Psychology Today, so it's been a really helpful resource.
Me too.
You're not paid by Psychology Today.
So I would say just one caveat for people, for leaders in organizations. So whether that be VPs, CEOs, whatever type of leadership position there may be, just kind of keep in mind that your organization likely has an EAP program for you as well, where you can get therapy as well. Because I know sometimes as leaders, we don't feel that's really scary for us. We don't want to go into mental health clinics because what if our people see us, these different types of things. So just keep in mind that a lot of the EAP programs within your organization also has telehealth and in-person therapy as well, if that's an option for you guys. So just kind of check into that as well, because I know sometimes, you know, at least for me, when I see leaders, they are at their end, right? So just kind of keep that in mind. EAP is a good resource for folks that are in those type of positions that are looking for care as well.
And EAP is the employee assistance programs.
Yeah.
I almost could not.
Thank you for helping me out on that one, ma'am.
So if insurance or finances are a barrier too, I know we talked a little bit about sliding scale fees, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about exactly what that means. So therapists and providers that offer sliding scale fees tend to have a range of fees that they charge for the service, so per session. And people that maybe don't have insurance, don't want to utilize their insurance, or even if you have a high deductible, right, and paying whatever your responsibility would be for the session presents a barrier to you. Sliding scale fees can be really useful. So a lot of therapists offer them, and I don't think that that's really well known to the public, but always ask that question of therapists that you're interviewing, whether they offer sliding scale fees. I know here in Maryland, we also have the Pro Bono Counseling Project, which therapists sign up to be a part of to offer free services to a certain number of people for the project. So I'm not sure nationally if there's an organization that exists that does the same thing. I know of Given Hour, but I think that's specific to military, if I'm not mistaken. But check and see if there's something like that in your area. And if finances are really a barrier, feel free to have that conversation with a therapist, because they may be willing to take on a case pro bono. So I just want to throw that out there.
And just to piggyback on the military part, if you are prior military, you can use your local VA clinic, okay? So keep that in mind. That service is yours, okay? You get to go there. You don't have to pay for anything. If you are a veteran and you have your DD-214 and you can show that, you can receive the therapy at the VA clinic. So keep that in mind as well.
Another thing I wanted to throw in, like, really quickly, so the name that I almost butchered earlier, the Boris L. Henson Foundation, that was started by actress Taraji P. Henson, has been doing rounds of free virtual therapy during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think they are locked right now. I think they're full, but they're doing it in rounds. And so the next one, there's a place on their website to sign up. And so you would get an email notification once they open that back up, and they've collaborated with therapists all across the country. And so they open it up. You can go in and select a therapist, and you're able to get a free virtual session. And they're doing this throughout the pandemic. So there is no end date currently on the work that they're doing. So that's another really timely resource right now.
Great, thanks. So another barrier that we talked about is the intersection of mental health and faith. So kind of feeling like maybe the issues that I'm dealing with should be handled in the church, and this perception that if I need support for my mental health, that's a sign of lack of faith or failure on my end. I know that I've had clients that have expressed shame that God, quote unquote, wasn't enough for them in terms of what they were dealing with in terms of their mental health. So how do we overcome that barrier?
So in this space, I think a big part of that is getting faith leaders on board with talking about mental health challenges and encouraging the people in their congregation, in their place of worship, regardless of what faith community it is, encouraging them to seek out mental health counseling. There are actually Christian counseling centers across the country that have a focus on faith and mental health and spirituality. In our community, for a lot of people, spirituality gives us a sense of purpose, a sense of well-being, like, you know, kind of figuring out your reason for being here. And so collaborating with a mental health person when there's challenges can definitely be impactful. So I definitely think it starts with faith leaders to have those conversations, especially within the house of worship, to let people know that this is a way to do, you know. And we've so I also mentioned in the beginning, like, I lead an initiative called Faith, Hope, Life, which is centered on helping faith communities across the country to be able to talk about suicide and suicide prevention. And one of the things that we, you know, try to give to faith leaders is that, like, in working together, you know, it can be really, really impactful for a person to combine their mental health therapy with their faith. And so we really want that message to go out, and we have resources on our website, which is faith-hope-life.org, where we have resources for faith leaders and faith communities to help have those conversations. But in my church here in Baltimore, like, we have a Christian counseling center that's attached to the church. My first lady is a licensed clinician. And so, like, we're able to talk about it. We've, you know, done a lot of mental health things. They've given out free therapy sessions themselves for people who just wanted to know what the therapeutic process was like. And so, like, having Jesus and a therapist is like having that together can really have some impact. And so I really think it starts with faith communities and faith leaders being open to helping their congregation and their places of worship, and people to feel comfortable with getting both. And one of the things that we also push too is that, you know, the same God that gifted, you know, doctors and physicians that we go to also gifted therapists and counselors. And so we try to make that link for people. And so it can really be an impactful thing when we get those things working together. But I think it starts at the top.
I have a question for you, Brandon. I'm sorry. What advice would you give to people who don't feel accepted, right, in their church based on whatever lifestyle they may be living or whatever they may be experiencing, depending on where they are? What advice would you give those people who are looking for mental health support but afraid to go to the church because they may feel judged?
Yeah, I mean, church hurt is a real thing. I mean, and it is, you know, it is major. And, you know, especially those of us, you know, who worked in faith communities and been in faith communities know the challenges with the LGBTQ community and the harm and the hurt that's been done, you know, with that community. And so it could be a challenge for people to feel accepted. And so there are churches and places of worship that are very welcoming of people of various backgrounds, various, you know, populations who've experienced different things as well. And so as we talk about, you know, finding the right therapist, also finding the right place of worship is also something that can be trial and error, like, you know, to be led to a certain place, to know what their values are, and to know, you know, what they believe is an important thing, because what we don't want is for people to go and, you know, remain hurt or be re-traumatized in those settings as well. So I think just making sure and knowing that the place that you're under really works with your values as well, in going back into the faith community. So you know, I think there's been you know, a realization of that, and I think a lot of people are trying to, you know, repatch those relationships, but it's going to take time. People have been very traumatized and hurt within faith communities, so I think it'll take some time. But it's been good to see progress with faith communities be able to accept that and know that there has been some church hurt, and also with people with mental illnesses as well, who have been isolated from faith communities or not accepted, or told that they had a lack of faith. Like, there's been some acceptance of that hurt too. So I think the progress is being made. And so, but I think with everything, is to really look up, make sure that it fits your values before kind of, you know, going in full force.
I would also say that, you know, if your faith and your religion is really important to you as a part of your identity, that's something that's going to drive which therapist you choose as well. So when you're looking for a therapist and when you're interviewing your therapist, asking questions about how they may integrate things like faith into therapy. And, you know, you may look specifically for a therapist who comes from a particular religious background. So keeping in mind that you can try and find a therapist who really fits into that need for you as well.
Good. So what about the distrust that people of color may feel towards the medical community? What are some ways to overcome that?
That's a big question. I mean, I think
We all paused.
yeah, right. Like, yeah, that's kind of like the question of the century. I think, I don't think we have any easy solutions, because I think that the distrust that people feel towards the medical community and mental health community is very valid. So I think a lot of what we've talked about choosing a therapist and how do you choose a therapist is a big part of it, in terms of, first finding a therapist that on paper looks like they're a good fit. And then when you get into the room, interviewing them and asking them all the questions you need to feel like, okay, maybe I can trust this person, or maybe I can work towards trusting this person. Recognizing you're not going to trust them right off the bat. It's going to take some time, and you have total control over what you share and what you don't share. And so when you find a therapist, like, okay, maybe this person's a good fit, let me give it some time of, several weeks or a few weeks to sort of feel them out and figure out if I can share more with this person. And so giving yourself that time and giving yourself that permission to take your time and figure out if it's going to be a good longer term fit. I'll stop there for now, and hear what others have to say.
I'll say advocating for yourself is really big. And I think that when we have this distrust, we don't feel like people will listen if we say something. And just because you go in a room with someone who's considered to be the expert doesn't mean you can't advocate for yourself. Doesn't mean that you can't disagree with something they're saying. Doesn't mean that you can't ask for clarity. Doesn't mean that you can't ask for a second opinion, right? You are the customer, you are the client, and you know your needs better than anyone else. So just make sure you're comfortable advocating. Sometimes you can be very intimidating, people with all these titles and credentials and all this stuff you see on the walls in offices, and you like, well, I better not question that person because they know more than me. Well, you know you more than I know you, right? And so just advocate for yourself, ask the questions, and don't be afraid to do that. And if you feel like you're not getting a service you need, there's always a patient advocate somewhere that you can go to in an organization or a clinic to kind of express those needs as well. But just know that you have the right to advocate and ask questions. It's your care, and you get a say in that as well.
Yeah, and to piggyback right off of, what they both said, you also have the right to find another therapist or another person to work with. Like, you can absolutely, if you think the therapeutic rapport is poor and you're not getting anything from it, or, I've talked to people where, they've gone into therapy and been working with people, and they had an exchange that really bothered them, where they thought there was cultural humility there. There wasn't, or their feelings about their identity as, a person of color, as LGBTQ, as, a person struggling with mental illness was questioned, in a way that they thought was inappropriate, and felt conflicted. Like they didn't know, what to do at this point, because they had put in so much time and they didn't want to, didn't feel like they could walk away from it. Right. And so just knowing and feeling empowered to be able to do that. I mean, I think that's, goes into a lot of what we talk about. Like, there's been so many things where we've been taught not to question medical professionals, even when it's been to our detriment. And we all know how, Black women aren't listened to, especially when they're pregnant, when they're going through childbirth. Like, it's a really large issue in this country. That's absolutely ridiculous when you look at the rates and the numbers of Black women who die during pregnancy. So being able to know that you can, in this therapeutic setting, you can walk away and find a new therapist. You can ask them for a referral if you just want to, go and find someone else. Like, there are resources that we talked about, but just feeling empowered to know and to trust your gut. And if something doesn't feel right and you aren't getting what you need, to go and find someone else.
Yeah, therapy is very much a client-driven process. It's collaborative. And as a client, you have as much a stake, if not more, in this process than the therapist, because you determine what you want to share with us, you determine what you want to work on, and you always have the right throughout the entire process to say, hey, you know, the approach that you've been taking, I don't really feel that it's working for me. Can we try something else? Or I'm having a difficult time feeling a solid connection with you, and discussing those things with your therapist. Any good therapist is not going to shy away from those conversations with you. They're going to be able to engage in that conversation and have a fruitful discussion to determine what are the best next steps. Are we a good fit for one another? If not, how can I try to help you find a provider who is a good fit, who can help you get this work done that you want to do? So you are allowed to absolutely speak up and raise any concerns that you have with your therapist, because this is your process and you can own it.
I think it's also important to know that one therapist doesn't represent all therapists. So if you have a bad experience, it does not mean that you can't find somebody who's a good fit for you. So continuing to work through that process of finding the right fit is so important. Because there are therapists out there who aren't a good fit for you. And honestly, there are bad therapists out there. And so if you have a bad experience, just remember, like, okay, I remember I saw that video, and I know that there is somebody out there for me who can help me. And so keeping that in mind and persisting.
That's a very good point. So earlier we talked about interviewing your therapist or your potential therapist. So what are some questions people should be asking to help determine if a therapist might be a good fit for them?
Go ahead, Dr. M. You was ready for that one.
Okay. Let's see. You know, I don't know if I've ever really done the best job interviewing my therapist, to be honest, but I will say some things that are good to ask are sort of the way that they address things related to identity, you know. So you can even ask them, like, have you worked with Black clients before? You know, how do you deal with differences in in terms of our cultures or our backgrounds, if there is a difference between you and the therapist? That I think, and I always tell therapists, like, those are questions they really need to ask. So that can also be a signal to you. If you're in a session and if you're in the first session or the second session and the therapist doesn't ask you about your identity and your culture and how that impacts you and how it's important to you, that may be a signal that maybe that therapist is not a good fit. But you can ask the question. You can ask the question of how they deal with if you bring up issues that come up, you know. So you might say something like, hey, Mr. or Miss or Dr. Therapist, you know, if I bring up something that made me uncomfortable in therapy, like, how do you usually deal with that? You know, and seeing if there's a safe space and an open space to be able to talk about issues that come up within the relationship.
Some of the things that I've had asked to me, and I've probably asked too, is, for example, I am single and I'm not married. So people will ask me, how can you do marital work with me if you're not married or if you're single? And I may not be teaching you how to be married, but I'm teaching you how to communicate, how to be intimate, how to work together. I'm teaching you partnerships. So when if you are a person that wants a therapist who has children or that's married, hey, do you have experience working with are you married yourself? If you're comfortable answering that question, right? If you are a little more sophisticated in the different types of treatments that you may need, ask that therapist, hey, do you work with women trauma? Do you work with CPT, which is cognitive processing therapy? Do you have CBT skills? Are you more solution-focused type of therapist, right? If you are a little bit more sophisticated in that, are you a therapist that pushes medications immediately off the bat? You know what I mean? What are your expectations for your therapist? Think about what your needs are. Because if you have a need, you want to be able to ask your therapist, can they fulfill that need? You know? And so I'm just think of it from that space. Why are you walking into the door? Why are you going to mental health therapy? And, and based on why you're there, talk to your therapist about that specifically and ask them if they've had that experience, right? All therapists may not work with certain trauma backgrounds, right? So you may want to ask that, hey, I've been dealing with this. Have you had an experience with this? Or can you recommend someone who has this experience, right? And so just understanding that you have a right to have your needs met. When you walk in the door, you need to be able to express that. Have some questions already on hand. A lot of times with me and my population, just by the hierarchy, they don't typically question me, but I force them to question me, if that makes sense. I'm like, okay, so what do you want from me? What do you expect from me? What do you need from me? So even if you're not as comfortable, have some written questions down before you walk into the therapist's office, and be able to ask those questions when you get in there. I just think it's so important to have the right fit. And if you have a therapist that doesn't look like you, just be 100. Look, have you worked with many Black people dealing with these issues? If they tell you no, can you recommend someone that's done that before? Because I really need someone to understand or empathize, right? They may not be able to sympathize because they haven't been experiencing that, to empathize and offer me some alternatives. Because just because someone isn't Black doesn't mean that they haven't worked with these issues, studied these issues, and have experience working with these issues. But you just gotta speak and open up your mouth and say what you need from people so that you can get that need met.
Yeah, I mean, I think all those are really, really great points. And I think, too, to kind of jump into, if you're going to a therapist who doesn't look like you, I think it's okay to ask, are there any, do you have any experiences or biases that may come into play, like in our therapeutic work? We know therapists have to do like continuing education and things like that. Have you in the last couple of years had any training on anti-racism? Like, you can ask those, those questions, to be able to make sure that you're getting the right therapist, especially for, I think for Black men too, like it's an issue that some people feel intimidated with us just being in the room one-on-one with us. And that may come up. And, there are also, a whole lot of, stereotypes on Black men and women. And so being able to just outright just say like, hey, is there anything, and I would say biases and experiences, because there are certain things that may have, come up in a, previous session with someone else, or something from their past, or the way they were brought up, that can come into play with how they help you get to a point where you're, you're in a better place. And asking those things up front can really kind of, and even seeing how they respond to those questions, once you ask it, because I don't think a lot of therapists would necessarily expect that to come out. So I think, even gauging like how they respond to that question, would be really key and kind of give you some good information.
Yeah, and I would say that these questions go for anything. So we talked a lot about if your potential therapist doesn't look like you, do you have experience working with Black clients? Do you have experience working with clients in this age range? Do you have experience working with clients who are dealing with these issues? Do you have experience working with clients of a certain faith background? These questions go for anything that pertains in your life. So, and they're fair game. And like Brandon said, depending on how they respond can really tell you a lot about the therapist themselves. So anything else people should be asking of their therapists? I would say one thing to keep in mind too, some questions that you may ask because of a therapist's boundaries, they may choose not to answer. So maybe if you do ask a therapist that you don't have a relationship with, if they're married or if they have children, they may choose at that point not to self-disclose based on their own boundaries. And I would say that that's not necessarily always a bad thing, as it is more so just representative of their comfort level and their choice as a clinician about what they will and won't disclose about their personal life to clients. So Anything else people should know before we move into just sharing any additional resources that we had for the Black community?
I'll say one more thing. This may be a little tiny bit, but sometimes it can come into play, is when you're meeting your therapist, ask about sessions, and because sometimes, like, for example, 8 to 10 sessions can be enough. Just like Dr. M stated, like, she did 6 sessions and this person was going well. So maybe ask them, hey, so how many sessions do you normally spend with a client? And just so you can kind of understand what you're working with. So if it's 12 weeks, 10 weeks, whatever it is, so you can really kind of understand what you're working with. And hopefully that'll be based on whatever the work you're doing. Sometimes some work takes a little bit longer than others, but I would say ask that question so you can kind of have an expectation on, how the progression of therapy, the sessions are going to go. That may be helpful as well, especially if you're doing a sliding scale, so you can know how much you need to put to the side or you need to save for that many amount of sessions and stuff like that, so you can be prepared.
Yeah, you just reminded me too, something else that I would recommend asking is how the therapist assesses for progress and how they open the dialogue with our clients about that. I think that's something that's really important in terms of therapy, having that open dialogue and having the therapist to initiate that. So yeah, thanks. So any other mental health resources for the Black community that anyone wanted to share? We talked about therapy for Black girls and some other foundations.
Yeah, so Therapy for Black Girls, Black Mental Health Alliance is also a really good one. I think I mentioned that earlier. We mentioned Boris L. Henson Foundation also has some really good resources. There's also an online community, the Green Heart Community. They're on Facebook, so it's a Facebook group where they have like mental health clinicians there and just advocates there to help people, get strategies for coping. They have a group for Black women and Black men, so it's definitely another resource to be able to tap into. And I had another one and I completely blanked. I lost it. Give me a second.
There's also the Loveland Foundation, thelovelandfoundation.org, and they also help Black women and girls be able to afford therapy as well, in addition to all the other ones I mentioned earlier. Oh, one other one that I think can be helpful is BetterHelp. That's also an online therapy resource, and they have a pretty affordable, I think it's something around like $140 per month, which is not cheap, but it may be more affordable than some other resources. So that's another one that one I think is available like nationally and internationally as well.
I have 2 colleagues who works with BetterHelp and one that works for Talkspace. And for those people who are not really telehealth type people or phone therapy type people, and you're more texters, right? You have a text option as well for therapy. So that's a good one to bring up because they have a variety, and you get to choose the profile on there. You get to see the therapist. Right now, BetterHelp is recruiting very, very heavy because of the pandemic. So that's definitely a great option. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah. Another one is the Black Emotional and Mental Health Collective, or BEAM, which is available at beam.community. And I know that they also have a Black virtual therapist directory on their website, in addition to other resources. So
I found it. So they, the AAKOMA project, and so that is AAKOMA. They do a lot of work with youth of color, and so that they have resources on their page as well. Dr. Braylon Noble, who does a ton in the Black mental health space, is the founder of that organization. And so their Twitter page as well, like, puts out resources for Black youth as well. So if you're looking for things for your kids, or if you are a young person who's watching this video, that is a good place to go to.
Great.
And I would just say for therapists, for the Black therapists out here in the land, you guys are working so hard out here, and just keeping connected with your colleagues if you need support. I know Facebook has a lot of therapists for the therapist type of forums as well on there, but just staying connected and checking in with a colleague if you need to. If you're not comfortable going to therapy yourself, just making sure you're staying connected, especially when you're working from home right now. A lot of people are kind of isolated at home, and you're kind of taking on all of the energy of everybody else that's struggling, when guess what? You're dealing with the same thing that many of our clients are dealing with. So just make sure you're taking care of yourself and just staying connected to your colleagues as much as you can, reaching out to people. I'm very active on social media. DM me, whatever you need to do. I just think that we have to take care of our minds so that we can take care of the people that depend on us every day. So you guys, please stay healthy as well.
All right. Any final words before we log off?
I'll say, you don't have to suffer on your own or suffer in silence. Like, there really are resources out there, even if it's something like, a Facebook group where you can share your experiences, even anonymously. I mean, just look for something that can help just relieve some of that pressure and just have some kind of outlet for you. It's really important because, like I said, we're going through so much right now. As Black people, and we don't have to do it alone. There's so much support out there. So please seek that out, even if it's just sending me a DM and, telling me what's going on. Some people have DM'd me and just told me like something that happened. And then I'm like, I'm sorry that happened to you. And like, that was enough for them in that moment. So reach out.
Just keep pushing, like keep working. If the first therapist didn't work, look for another one. If the first resource doesn't work, like look for another one. As much as you can, reach out. And if you need help, as Juliette said, like being able to connect with someone that who can help, like, do the searches for you. Sometimes you're not in a place to do it yourself. Like even just to ask a friend to say, like, this is overwhelming. Like, I'm trying to look for something, hard to do it. Here's what I'm looking for. Can you do this for me? Like, can you pick up that baton? And help me to, to find someone. Like I want to look, like I'm committed to doing this, but right now, like, I just don't have the energy, and it's okay to do that. So, even if you need to, call in on your supports to help you with that, definitely do that. And I know each of us has volunteered to help anyone looking at this video as well, to help find resources.
Yeah, I definitely echo what everyone said so far. We need you here, so please don't give up. We are more than happy to help point you in the direction of resources, in addition to the resources that we discussed today. And I hope that if you can take anything away from the video today, it's that all of us here talked about the fact that we're in therapy. So it just goes to show how normal going to therapy is. And you don't have to wait until things are horrible to go to therapy. You can go to therapy whenever you want. Even if you feel like things are going completely fine in your life, you can still go to therapy. So please reach out, find the support that you need, and know that there is so much to be proud of in taking care of yourself. All right, well, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, especially Brandon, Crystal, and Juliette. So thank you for sharing your expertise with us and for helping us to create this resource. So thank you.
Thank you for organizing.
Thank you for organizing.
Absolutely. Thanks, Janel.